All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we're going to try to unpack a really complex situation. It has to do with the potential end to a conflict that's been going on for decades in Turkey. And you actually send in some fascinating articles on this. And it all kind of centers around this guy, Abdullah Ocalan. You might have heard of him. He's the imprisoned leader of the Kurdistan Workers Party, better known as the PKK. And recently he's called for the group to completely disband, like totally give up arms after 40 years of armed struggle against Turkey.
Yeah, it's a really major shift, especially considering that Ocalan, despite being in prison since 1999, is still a pretty powerful figure. His words carry a lot of weight within the PKK. So yeah, this call for dissolution is a pretty huge development.
It is. It is. And you know what makes it even more interesting is that the peace initiative, it didn't actually come from someone you might expect. It was actually Devlet Bahceli, President Erdogan's coalition partner. And he's, a pretty hardline nationalist, but he's the one who first suggested that Ocalan could be granted parole if the PKK disarmed. It's quite a twist, right?
Yeah.
So today on the deep dives, let's try to unpack, why this is all happening now, what the motivations might be for all the different players involved, and what this could all mean for Turkey and its Kurdish population. So could you give us a quick overview of kind of who the key players are and what their roles are in this whole kind of intricate dance?
Of course. So yeah, we've got Ocalan, the imprisoned PKK leader. Like we said, he still wields a lot of influence despite his imprisonment. And then there's Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey. Now, he's facing term limits, which puts him in a bit of a tough spot. If he wants to extend his rule, he may need to, change the constitution or call early elections. And that's where the pro-Kurdish party comes in, formerly known as the People's Democratic Party, or HDP for short.
So the HDP, they kind of hold some cards in parliament. And Erdogan might actually need their support to stay in power. That creates a really interesting dynamic, considering they're kind of on opposite sides of this conflict. So what does the HDP want in this whole scenario?
Well, their main goal has always been to try and secure greater rights and autonomy for the Kurdish people within Turkey. And this actually aligns with the PKK's more recent demands as well, which have kind of shifted away from a fully independent Kurdish state and are now focusing on achieving some of these goals, but within the existing Turkish state.
Okay, so it sounds like Erdogan needs the HDP. And the HDP might be able to use this opportunity to kind of push for some of the things that they want. But what about Bahceli, this ultra-nationalist who, once called for Ocalan's execution? Why is he suddenly so eager to make peace?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. Some people think that, Bahceli sees this as a way to kind of weaken the Kurdish resistance movement, while at the same time bolstering Erdogan's image as a peacemaker. It could also be a strategic move to try and shift the focus away from political solutions, like granting autonomy, and instead try to push for things like economic incentives.
So it's kind of like saying, hey, look, we'll give you some economic development in the southeast. Now let's just forget about this whole autonomy thing.
Yeah, you could see it that way. But it's really important to remember that this whole peace initiative is happening. It's happening against a backdrop of a lot of ongoing repression, actually.
Yeah.
Even while these talks are going on, Erdogan's government has been cracking down on Kurdish politicians and journalists and activists. Like one of the articles you sent mentioned the Good Party, an opposition party. They hung up this massive banner to remember PKK victims. And it shows that there's still a lot of deep wounds, a lot of distrust on both sides. It's a very fragile situation.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't sound like a straightforward reconciliation. And, this internal struggle within Turkey is already so complex, but then it's also playing out against this whole backdrop of regional instability, too. What's happening in Syria and Iraq, that just adds another layer of complexity to the PKK situation, right?
Oh, absolutely. The PKK has bases in northern Iraq, and Turkey has been conducting military operations there for years. But recently, actually, Iraq and Turkey have kind of found some common ground, especially when it comes to countering the PKK,
right?
Which puts even more pressure on the group.
So it seems like the PKK is really feeling the squeeze. They've got the Turkish military operations. They've got this political pressure on their allies in Turkey. And even their regional safe havens are becoming less secure. Could this be why Ocalan is calling for the PKK to dissolve now? Is this a strategic move? Is this a group that's just feeling cornered?
Well, yeah, I think it's definitely a factor. The articles that you shared, they suggest that survival and getting some relief from all of this mounting pressure, that might be a stronger motivation for the PKK right now than trying to achieve all of their political goals, all at once.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that their demands have actually kind of evolved over time.
Yeah. From what I understand, they initially wanted a fully independent Kurdish state, right?
Exactly. But more recently, they've kind of shifted focus. Now they're more focused on, achieving things like greater autonomy within Turkey.
Yeah.
And expanding the rights for the Kurdish population, which makes up a significant portion of the country.
Right. But even those demands, the autonomy and more rights, those haven't exactly been welcomed with open arms by the Turkish government, have they?
No, not really. And that's really a key point of contention here. It's still not clear what concessions, if any, Erdogan is actually willing to make. So analysts think that he might just opt for those economic incentives like that development plan that we talked about earlier, without actually addressing some of the deeper political issues, the real issues that are at the heart of this whole conflict.
Yeah, it almost feels like a Band-Aid solution, you know what I mean? It's like they're trying to address the symptoms, but they're not really dealing with the root cause. But even if the PKK does agree to dissolve, I mean, will that actually lead to lasting peace? And will it even begin to address those underlying grievances, or could it create a vacuum for new forms of resistance to emerge?
That's a really crucial question. And there are just so many unknowns. I mean, for starters, will everyone in the PKK actually lay down their arms? Like, if Ocalan says, this is it, we're done.
Right. He might be the symbolic leader, but the PKK it's a pretty complex organization, right? You mentioned factions earlier. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? How might those different viewpoints within the PKK impact Ocalan's call to dissolve?
Sure. So the PKK, it has a variety of different factions and commanders. Some of them operate outside of Turkey, and they may not all be on board with this idea of dissolving the group entirely. There could be some internal resistance, maybe even splinter groups that just refuse to disarm, and they continue to carry out attacks.
And what about on the other side of things? Even if the PKK largely agrees to disband, would Erdogan really follow through with that promise of parole for Ocalan? It seems like a pretty huge concession, especially considering that Turkey and its allies, they still officially label him as a terrorist, right?
Yeah, it would be. It would be a very bold move for Erdogan. Whether he goes through with it or not, it probably depends on, whether he believes that he can secure his own political goals. Things like constitutional changes, early elections.
Yeah.
Without having to make that kind of concession. The stakes they're incredibly high for everyone involved.
So it sounds like the future of this whole peace bid really hinges on this delicate balance of power. It almost sounds like a high stakes poker game where no one's showing their cards, So what are some of the different scenarios that we could see play out here?
Well, okay, let's start with kind of the optimistic scenario.
Yeah.
Ocalan's call is fully embraced by all the PKK factions. They completely disarm and they disband. And Erdogan, sensing an opportunity to gain some political stability and maybe even some international goodwill, he grants Ocalan parole, and he makes a few concessions on Kurdish rights. Maybe not full autonomy, but something meaningful, something that actually addresses some of their core grievances. This could potentially usher in a new era of peace and reconciliation for Turkey.
Okay, so that's kind of the best case scenario. It does sound maybe a little too good to be true, though, right? Given the long history of conflict and the mistrust between the two sides. So what about the other end of the spectrum? What's the worst case scenario look like?
All right. Well, on the pessimistic side, we could see Ocalan's call being met with a lot of resistance from within the PKK. And that could lead to, even further fragmentation and continued violence. And, if the peace process collapses completely, Erdogan, under pressure from nationalist factions and unwilling to give up any real power, he might just resort to, even harsher crackdowns on the Kurdish movement. And that would, unfortunately, just perpetuate the cycle of violence.
Okay, so we've got the two extremes, right? We've got lasting peace on one end and a continuation of the conflict on the other. But what about something in between those two extremes? Is there a middle ground here?
Yeah, that's where things get particularly interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So imagine this. Ocalan's call is largely heated, right? But there are some holdouts, splinter groups, and they continue to carry out these attacks. Now, Erdogan, he's caught between a desire for peace and this need to appease his nationalist base, right? So he might offer some minor concessions on cultural rights, but he stops short of granting any real autonomy. this could result in, this kind of fragile peace that's marked by ongoing tensions and maybe some sporadic violence.
And how would that kind of scenario play out for the HDP, the pro-Kurdish party in the parliament? They're in a precarious position, it seems.
Yeah, they are. They face a really tough choice. They could try to leverage their position to gain some concessions from Erdogan, in exchange for their support in parliament. But if they're seen as being too closely aligned with the PKK, especially if those splinter groups are still active, that could backfire on them big time. It could undermine their political standing and potentially even put them at risk.
So even if the PKK disbands, this whole Kurdish question in Turkey, it remains a really complex and potentially volatile issue.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There are no simple solutions here.
Yeah.
This is a situation that requires, it requires careful consideration,
Yeah.
a nuanced understanding of the historical context,
Yeah.
and a willingness to acknowledge the perspectives and the experiences of everyone involved.
Okay, so we've laid out the potential paths forward, right? We've got peace, we've got continued conflict, and then we've got this kind of fragile middle ground. What does all of this mean for, like, the average person in Turkey? Like, what should they be watching for as this situation continues to unfold?
Well, I think there are a few key things to keep an eye on. First, watch for any signs of unity or dissent within the PKK as they, respond to Ocalan's call. Are they presenting a united front, or are there some cracks starting to emerge? Second, pay attention to the specific concessions that Erdogan is actually willing to make and what demands the HDP puts forward. Are their positions, are they kind of aligning, or are there some major points of disagreement? And finally, observe the level of repression. Is Erdogan's government easing up on its crackdown on Kurdish politicians and activists? Or is that continuing even while these peace talks are, supposedly underway?
So we're looking for clues about the balance of power, the potential for compromise, and whether the government's actions are actually matching their words, right?
Exactly.
It's a lot to process, but those are the factors that will likely determine which path this whole situation actually takes.
Wow, it really feels like we're watching this really delicate dance, with all these different players kind of carefully calculating their next move.
Yeah, and it's a high stakes dance for sure. The potential consequences here, they could reach far beyond just Turkey's borders.
It makes you think about the bigger picture too, right? Like this whole situation with Ocalan and the PKK and all of Erdogan's maneuvering, it really says a lot about the state of Turkish politics.
It does. It highlights this enduring Kurdish question, the challenges that Turkish democracy is facing, and this really complex relationship between domestic politics and all those regional dynamics.
Yeah. This moment, this potential turning point, it feels so incredibly significant. What do you think it reveals about the future of Turkey and its relationship with its Kurdish population? Well, that's the question, isn't it? Is this a genuine opportunity for peace and reconciliation? Is this a chance to finally address those longstanding grievances and really forge this new path forward? Or is this just going to be, another chapter in this long and painful saga? Like just a brief pause before that cycle of violence and mistrust starts all over again. I mean,
We've explored the potential outcomes, right? We've talked about lasting peace, we've talked about continued conflict, and we've talked about this kind of fragile middle ground. But as you said, there are no easy answers here.
No, there really aren't. And that's why I think it's so important to approach this whole situation with a lot of nuance, to consider all the different perspectives, and to resist those simplistic narratives or those quick fixes that some people might be offering.
Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about today. It's clear that this is an incredibly complex situation, and the stakes are very high.
They are. And I really encourage everyone who's listening to delve deeper into this issue, examine those sources that you sent in, and form your own conclusion.
Yeah, that's what these deep dives are all about, right? It's not just about absorbing information. It's about developing a much more profound understanding of all the different forces that are shaping our world.
And perhaps most importantly, using that understanding to inform our hopes for the future, for Turkey, for the Kurdish people, and for a more peaceful world.
Well said, well said. That's a great note to end on. Thanks so much for diving into this with me.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listener, thanks for sharing those really thought-provoking articles with us. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.